Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling something I think a lot of you have probably thought about, leadership. And I'm really excited about this one because you sent over this like really in-depth leadership training module. But the thing that jumped out at me right away is that this stuff isn't just for, CEOs and executives. This is about how to be more influential, how to really drive change, how to boost your impact wherever you are, whatever your role.
Yeah, I mean, that's what really struck me too, just looking at this material. It doesn't matter if you're managing a team, if you're leading a project, or even if you just want to, be more effective in your everyday work. These are like fundamental principles.
Yeah.
They're about inspiring action, getting things done, having a real impact. So what we want to do today is pull out those really crucial insights, the stuff that's going to make a difference, save you some time, and give you a really solid understanding of, well, what it takes to be a great leader.
Okay, so let's get into it. The module kicks off with a pretty fundamental question. What is leadership, really? And they define it as, let me get this right, inspiring change and driving results through vision, motivation, and influence. I think that's really interesting, right? It's not just about barking orders or telling people what to do. It's about showing them where you're going, getting them excited about it, and then actually helping them make it happen. And then right off the bat, they throw this discussion activity at you, asking you to think about a leader you really admire, someone you really look up to. And then they ask, what are those three key characteristics that make them so effective? What do you think? Like, who comes to mind for you when you think about that?
That's really smart, I think, because it helps you connect with the idea of leadership on a more personal level. You're not just thinking about some abstract definition. You're thinking of someone someone you respect. And what's really interesting is that even though everyone's going to come up with different specific qualities, maybe it's decisiveness, maybe it's empathy, maybe it's strategic thinking, the impact is always going to be about creating positive change, bringing people together around a common goal.
Right, right. And then the module breaks down the core areas that great leaders, really hone in on. And they break it down into five main pillars. The first one is strategy, which, I mean, that's the high level thinking, the vision for where things are going, but it's not just a plan. It's got to be like a story, right? A story about the future that makes people want to take action now. Then there's execution, which is all about, getting things done, making things happen, being efficient, effective. And then there's talent management, which is really about attracting, keeping, and making sure your key people are engaged. It's not just about hiring. It's about creating an environment where people want to learn and grow. And then there's talent development, which is really about nurturing those future leaders, helping people reach their potential, And then finally, there's personal proficiency. This is about being the kind of leader that people trust, being someone who walks the walk, someone with integrity, emotional intelligence, all that good stuff.
And, when you step back and look at it, you can really see how these 5 areas all connect.
Yeah.
Like, you might have an amazing strategy, but if you can't execute it, if you don't have the right people, the right team, it's just an idea on paper, right? And like you were saying, personal proficiency, that's kind of like the foundation. Trust is everything when it comes to leadership. And the module even has this training exercise where they ask you to think about your own strengths, in these areas. And maybe one area where you could improve. It's kind of a cool little self-assessment.
Totally. Okay, so moving on, the module gets into this thing called your leadership brand. And, I know the word brand can sound a little corporate-y, but really it's just how others see you as a leader, your reputation, the impact you have. And they actually have this really cool, really hands-on 5-step process for figuring out how to define it. The first step is, they ask you to think about what you want to achieve in the next year. What are your big goals? What do you want to get done?
That's a really crucial first step, because your brand should really be tied to what you're trying to accomplish, right? Like if you're trying to lead really innovative projects, well, then your brand might include words like creative, visionary, forward-thinking, that sort of thing. And then the next step is to come up with 6 key words that you want people to associate with you as a leader. Like they give examples like, honest, motivated, strategic. What words come to mind for you when you think about how you want to be perceived?
And then step 3 is where it gets really interesting. You take those 6 words and you combine them into 3 2-word phrases. They give the example of strategically motivated. It's about getting really specific, really concise.
Yeah, and it forces you to think about how all those different aspects of your brand work together. It helps you create a clearer picture. And then step 4, they give you this template for actually writing out your leadership brand statement. It goes, I want to be known for being your phrases so that I can deliver your results. So using their example, it'd be like, I want to be known for being strategically motivated, results-oriented, and a collaborative communicator so that I can deliver successful project launches and build high-performing teams. Something like that.
And then the last step is all about getting feedback, putting it out there in the real world. They call it validate and adjust.
Yep.
So, share your statement with people you trust, colleagues, mentors, and see if it resonates with them, because their persona is a big part of how your brand actually plays out, right? So this interactive task, as they call it, is really about making sure that what you want to project aligns with how people actually see you. It's a really, really useful exercise for anyone who wants to be more intentional about how they lead.
It makes you wonder how often we actually stop and think about how we're being perceived. And, does that align with what we're trying to achieve professionally? I think this whole approach is really valuable. It gives you a framework for doing that.
Absolutely. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. The module dives into making a strong first impression. And the stat they throw out there is pretty mind-blowing. It takes just 7 seconds. 7 seconds to form an opinion about someone. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, Think about that the next time you're meeting someone new.
And what's really fascinating is that a lot of what happens in those first few seconds isn't even verbal. It's all about body language. It's about energy. And the module actually gives you some pretty solid tips for making a good first impression. They start with pre-adjust your attitude, which is a really good reminder that, how you're feeling inside, it shows on the outside, whether you realize it or not.
Right. If you're feeling stressed or flustered, people are going to pick up on that. So yeah, adjust your attitude. And then, they talk about things like having a confident stance, a natural smile, making eye contact, a firm handshake, all that good stuff. Oh, and I really like this one. They say to lean in slightly when someone's talking to you. It shows that you're really engaged and interested in what they're saying.
Yeah, those little things, they might seem small, but they add up, They send a message. And the module actually has this practice activity where they encourage you to role play these first impressions, which I know can sound a little awkward, but it's actually a pretty effective way to become more aware of how you come across, It's worth trying out.
Yeah.
Even if it's just thinking about these things before your next meeting or interaction,
So now let's talk about keeping people engaged. And the module really zeroes in on 3 key drivers. They call them autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is all about giving people a sense of ownership over their work, letting them make decisions about how they do things, how they manage their time, all within reason, of course. Think about it, when you feel like you have control over your work, you're so much more invested.
It's interesting, because autonomy really taps into something deep, I think. It's about that feeling of being in control. When people feel like they have a real say in what they're doing, they're more motivated, they're more creative, they're more likely to stick with it, to see things through. It's how we're wired.
Right. And then there's mastery, which is all about helping people develop their skills, really becoming experts at what they do.
Yeah.
And it's not just about formal training. It's about giving people opportunities to grow, giving them good feedback, recognizing when they're making progress.
And that feeling of progress, of learning and getting better at something, that's incredibly motivating. It creates a culture where learning is valued, where development is part of the everyday experience. It's really powerful.
And then finally, there's purpose. This is about connecting what people do every day to something bigger, something meaningful. Whether it's contributing to the company's mission, helping customers, or even making a difference in the world. When people understand the why behind their work, it gives them a whole new level of motivation. And the module has this case study discussion where you get to think about real-world examples of teams that are really engaged, which, always helps to make it more concrete.
Yeah, I think for leaders, it's really about creating that environment where autonomy, mastery, and purpose can all thrive. It's about delegating effectively, creating opportunities for growth, and constantly reminding people why their work matters, showing them the impact they're having.
Totally. And that leads right into the next section, which is all about creating a positive work environment. And they start off with this really powerful quote. It says, change the environment and people will change. It's really something to think about,
It is. I mean, just think about your own experience. If you're in a space, whether it's physical or virtual, where it feels open, collaborative, energizing, you're much more likely to feel those things yourself, to work that way.
Yeah.
But if the environment feels, restrictive, negative, or just kind of bland, it can really drag you down. You know, it can stifle creativity, it can hurt morale. So the module encourages you to really look at your workplace culture. Is it open? Is it engaging? Or is it kind of closed off and, restrictive?
And then they talk about actually making changes to the physical space to make it more collaborative, more open, things like rearranging desks so people can interact more easily, creating common areas where people can connect. And they even have this team challenge where they encourage you to think about one specific change you could make to your own environment, even if it's just your home office. What could you tweak to make it a little more positive, a little more conducive to good work?
And it's not just about the physical space, It's also about the social and emotional environment. Are there opportunities for people to connect, to collaborate? Is feedback encouraged? Is there a sense of psychological safety where people feel like they can speak up, share their ideas without fear of judgment? Those things are just as important, maybe even more important.
Absolutely. Now, here's an idea that I think is so relevant these days. It's about managing energy, not just time. And the module makes this really good point that, you can't be at your best all the time if you're constantly stressed and burnt out. It's not just about how many hours you work, it's about the quality of those hours.
Yeah.
It's about being focused and present.
Yeah, we all have a limited amount of energy, mental and physical. And if you're always pushing yourself, you're going to hit a wall eventually, right? You're going to burn out. So the module suggests some really practical strategies for managing energy. Things like taking regular breaks throughout the day, even just for a few minutes. It can make a huge difference.
Right. And then they talk about the importance of exercise, which, we all know is good for us, but it's especially important for managing energy levels. And they suggest things like mindfulness or relaxation techniques to help manage stress, just ways to kind of reset and recharge.
Yeah, these aren't just like nice to haves. They're really essential for doing your best work consistently. And the module actually has this personal development task where they ask you to pick one new habit this week that will help you improve your energy and focus. It could something simple like taking a 5-minute walk every hour or trying a quick meditation session.
Great ideas. Okay, and then the module wraps up with what they call the 4 C's of team performance. And this is a really useful framework for understanding what makes a team successful. The first C is context. And this is all about the overall environment the team works in, the culture, the goals, the kind of big picture stuff.
Right. It sets the stage for everything else. The team's context really shapes how they operate, how they make decisions, and ultimately how successful they are.
Then there's composition, which is about having the right mix of people on the team. People with different skills, different personalities, different experiences. It's about making sure everyone's strengths are being used.
And it's not just about individual talent. It's about how those talents work together, how they complement each other. A diverse team's going to have a much wider range of perspectives, a lot more creative potential. It's really valuable.
Then the third C is competencies, which is about having clear goals, clear roles and responsibilities, and the skills to achieve those goals. It's about knowing what you need to do and having the ability to do it well.
It's also about communication, how the team communicates, how they solve problems, how they make decisions. You could have the most talented people in the world, but if they can't work together effectively, they're not going to get very far.
And then the final C is change adaptability, which is really about how well a team can respond to change, how flexible they are. And in today's world where things are changing all the time, that's more important than ever.
Yeah, teams have to be able to adapt, to learn new things, to adjust their strategies as needed. And the module has this group activity where you can use these 4 C's to evaluate a team's performance. And even if you're not leading a team right now, I think it's a useful framework to think about, how teams work in general.
Right, right. And then at the very end, they have this final commitment section,
Yeah.
which I thought was a great way to kind of wrap things up. And it just asks you, what's the one big takeaway from all this that you're going to commit to applying right away? And they actually encourage you to write it down, make it real.
I love that.
Yeah.
Because, all this knowledge, all these ideas, they're only valuable if you actually do something with them,
Yeah.
right? If you take action. And by picking that one key takeaway, you're much more likely to follow through.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just recap what we covered. We talked about what leadership really means, the 5 core areas that great leaders focus on, how to build your own leadership brand, and the importance of making a good first impression. We also looked at how to keep people engaged, the importance of creating a positive work environment, managing energy, and the 4 key elements of high-performing teams.
And, these aren't just theories. These are things that anyone can start using today, no matter what their job title is, to be more effective, to be more influential.
Yeah.
It's all about being intentional, understanding how your actions impact others.
So as you go about your day-to-day, think about this. Which of these areas really resonated with you? What's one small thing you can do differently, starting today, to put these principles into practice? And how might that change not just how you work, but how you interact with the people around you? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into leadership fundamentals.